Oliver Grant sat at his cluttered desk in the corner of the elections office, staring blankly at the flickering computer screen. The sound of a nearby copier hummed steadily, punctuated by the occasional groan of a jammed paper tray. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, unflattering glow on the sea of beige cubicles around him. His job was simple: organizing voting records, checking ballot logistics, and filing endless forms. It was the kind of work that required just enough attention to prevent mistakes, but offered no real challenge or reward. Oliver had become a master of blending in, his quiet demeanor and average performance ensuring he was neither praised nor criticized. Most days he arrived at 8:30 a.m. sharp, poured himself a weak cup of coffee from the communal pot, and worked steadily until 5 p.m., taking exactly 30 minutes for lunch. It was a life defined by routine, predictable and unchanging. Yet deep down, Oliver often felt like a cog in a machine he didn't fully understand or care about. One Tuesday morning, as Oliver was sorting through a stack of emails, he noticed one with the subject line, "Mandatory Training Presidential Election Readiness." His heart sank slightly. These sessions were notorious for being long, dull, and filled with jargon. Still, he dutifully opened the email and scanned the details. The training was scheduled for the following week, held in a conference room at City Hall. Attendance was not optional. Oliver sighed and jotted it down on his calendar, his pencil pressing a little harder than necessary. He didn't particularly dislike his job, but he didn't love it either. Politics felt like a distant, noisy circus, and he preferred to stay on the sidelines. The day of the training arrived, but Oliver didn't. That morning, a light drizzle tapped against his apartment window. He woke up, stared at the clock, and hesitated. He thought about the crowded room, the awkward conversations, and the hours of slides and lectures. For a moment, he considered calling in sick. Then he rationalized that his role in the office was minor. Surely no one would notice if he skipped. So Oliver stayed home. By mid-afternoon, guilt had begun to creep in. He sat on his couch, flipping through channels but finding no comfort in the colorful chaos of daytime TV. His inbox was already piling up with emails he couldn't ignore forever. He glanced at the training memo again, now buried under a pile of unopened mail. "Why am I like this?" he muttered to himself, setting the remote aside. The following day at work, no one seemed to notice his absence. Co-workers buzzed about the upcoming election, but Oliver felt detached from their excitement. He overheard snippets of conversations about new policies and procedures, but the details floated past him, as abstract as a foreign language. It wasn't until a week later, when his supervisor asked for feedback on the training, that Oliver felt the full weight of his decision. Standing in the break room, fumbling for a response, he managed a weak, "It sounded insightful," before excusing himself. That night, lying in bed, Oliver stared at the cracks in his ceiling. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was missing something, not just at work, but in life. The world outside his office seemed so big, so full of possibilities, yet he had confined himself to this small, safe corner. For the first time in years, he wondered what it would feel like to step out of the shadows. A few weeks after missing the training, Oliver was back at his desk, working through his usual stack of paperwork. His supervisor, a tall man with a booming voice named Mr. Thompson, approached him with an unexpected request. "Oliver, I need someone reliable to go up to Broomfield next week," Mr. Thompson said, holding out a packet of documents. "They need an extra set of eyes to monitor the town's early voting." Oliver blinked, taken aback. Broomfield was a small town hours away, barely a dot on the map. Traveling there would mean spending several days away from his quiet life and his routine. He wanted to say no, to argue that someone else was surely better suited for the task. But something in Mr. Thompson's expression told him this wasn't really a request. Sure, Mr. Thompson," he muttered, reaching out to take the packet. He felt a pang of anxiety at the thought of venturing so far from his comfort zone, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it down. On the morning of his departure, Oliver found himself driving down an empty stretch of highway, a weak sunrise casting a pale light over the misty landscape. Broomfield was hours away, and his only company was the hum of his car and a thermos of lukewarm coffee. As he drove, the landscape gradually transformed from the familiar urban sprawl to open fields, dotted with the occasional farmhouse or rusted windmill. The air seemed fresher, crisper, and for the first time in a while, Oliver felt a faint spark of curiosity. He turned up the radio, letting the music fill the silence, trying to ease the knot of nerves in his stomach. His first stop was a small gas station on the edge of a town he hadn't caught the name of. As he filled his tank, a young man approached him, a camera slung around his neck. "Hey there," the man greeted with a wide smile. "Mind if I snap a picture of your car? I'm working on a project about road trips." Oliver was a bit startled but shrugged. "Sure, go ahead." The young man introduced himself as Ryan, an aspiring photographer who had been traveling across the country, capturing images of people and places that represented the heart of America. They chatted briefly, and Ryan shared some of his own story, how he was chasing his dreams, how he felt the need to document the country's spirit in a time of change. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Oliver found himself nodding along, admiring the young man's passion. "People think voting doesn't matter," Ryan said, "but it's just another way we express ourselves, you know. I want my photos to capture that, to remind people that every person counts." As Oliver got back in his car, he felt a slight shift in his own attitude. Here was someone who believed deeply in what he was doing, and it made him question his own role. Further along, Oliver pulled into a diner for lunch. The place was cozy, filled with the aroma of coffee and bacon. He settled into a booth, ordering a sandwich, when a man in a military jacket caught his attention. The man was chatting animatedly with a waitress about the upcoming election. "People forget what this country's built on," the man was saying, his voice filled with conviction. "We fought for these rights, and now some folks act like it's just a game." Curiosity piqued, Oliver introduced himself and learned that the man, Tom, was a retired Army veteran who dedicated his life to serving his community. They talked for a while, with Tom sharing stories about the people he'd met and the ideals he still held dear. Though life had dealt him hardships, he hadn't lost faith in his country or its people. As Oliver listened, he felt something stir within him. This wasn't the cynicism he'd grown used to at the office. These were real people, passionate and determined, carrying hope even in the smallest towns. His journey continued, and at every stop, Oliver seemed to encounter someone else with their own story, their own reason to believe in the importance of voting. In Broomfield, he met a local librarian, Mrs. Jenkins, who ran a volunteer program to help people register to vote. Though she was older and often tired, she greeted each person with a warm smile, patiently explaining the process and answering every question. "This is our chance to shape the future," she told Oliver, her voice gentle but firm. "If we don't do our part, who will?" By the time Oliver reached his destination, he felt strangely invigorated. These ordinary people, Ryan the photographer, Tom the veteran, Mrs. Jenkins the librarian, had shown him a different side of the country and perhaps a different side of himself. As he stood in the small town hall, watching the townspeople come in to cast their votes, Oliver felt something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of pride, of purpose. Maybe, just maybe, his role in this vast, complex process mattered. The farther Oliver drove, the more he began to see a different side of the country, a version of America he had never noticed from behind his desk. Each small town he passed through seemed to have its own character, its own rhythm. Here, people waved as they drove by. Neighbors stopped to chat on street corners, and children played outside long after the sun dipped below the horizon. One evening, Oliver arrived in a town called Willow Creek, where he'd be staying for a few nights to oversee the early voting. Willow Creek was tiny, with one main street, a single grocery store, and a handful of modest homes lining the quiet road. That evening, as Oliver was checking in at the town hall to meet the local election volunteers, he was greeted by a woman with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "Hi, I'm Helen. Welcome to Willow Creek," she said brightly. Helen was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and an energetic presence that made Oliver feel instantly at ease. She was a volunteer with the campaign of a local candidate, and she'd been organizing community events to encourage voter turnout. As they walked through the town hall, she shared her story. "I've lived here my whole life, and I'll tell you, this town is small, but we've got heart. People here believe their voice matters, even if no one outside our borders knows our name," she said, her voice filled with pride. Helen explained that she spent countless hours knocking on doors, setting up voting information booths, and even organizing rides to the polling station for those without transportation. Her dedication to this small, often overlooked town was contagious. She spoke of each resident as if they were family, and she was determined to make sure every one of them had a chance to vote. "Why do you do all this?" Oliver asked, genuinely curious. "It's a lot of work." Helen's eyes sparkled with a quiet determination. "Because every vote matters, Oliver. I know it's hard to believe, but these people here, they have dreams, worries, hopes for the future. And when they vote, they feel seen, like they're part of something bigger. It's not just about who wins, it's about feeling like we belong." Something stirred in Oliver as he listened to her. He thought about his own job, about the piles of paperwork and endless tasks that felt so distant from the people he was supposed to serve. Helen, on the other hand, saw her work as something meaningful, something that connected her to her community. Over the next few days, Oliver continued to meet people like Helen, quiet, determined individuals working tirelessly to support their communities. He met Linda, a high school teacher who organized a Future Voters program to educate students on the importance of civic engagement. She spoke passionately about inspiring the next generation, teaching them to be informed, responsible citizens. Another day, he met Bill, a retired factory worker who volunteered at the local food bank and spent his weekends fixing up old playgrounds for neighborhood kids. He had no official title, no recognition, but his pride in his town was clear in every story he told. "It's the little things that hold a town together," Bill said, his rough hands folded in his lap. "You don't need a big title to make a difference." As Oliver listened to these people, he felt a growing realization. Here were people who had found a way to make a difference, despite being in places that the media and politicians often overlooked. They didn't do it for recognition or reward. They did it because they believed in their community and in each other. One evening, as he walked through the town's quiet streets, Oliver realized he'd been carrying a kind of resignation within him, a sense that his life was small and his work unimportant. But these people, Helen, Linda, Bill, showed him that even small acts could create ripples, touching lives and building a sense of belonging. For the first time, Oliver wondered if perhaps his role in the elections office wasn't as insignificant as he had thought. He'd been so caught up in the routine that he'd forgotten the impact that democracy, even on a small scale, could have on people's lives. Under the stars that night in Willow Creek, Oliver felt a new resolve, a spark that had been dormant for far too long. Maybe, just maybe, he had the power to bring some of that hope and belief back into his own work, and in some small way to make a difference. Oliver leaned against the hood of his car, the crisp evening air of Willow Creek brushing against his face. He had just finished his final task in the town, ensuring that all voting equipment was set up and ready for the next day. By all accounts, his job was done, and he could head back to the office. Yet as he stared down the empty road leading out of town, he felt an unshakable sense of hesitation. Returning to his desk meant returning to the life he'd always known. Safe, predictable, but uninspired. Out here, however, he had begun to see and feel something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. As if sensing his inner turmoil, Helen approached him. She handed him a thermos of coffee, her usual smile tempered by a hint of concern. "You look like a man with a decision to make," she said, sitting down on the bench beside him. Oliver sighed. "I'm supposed to head back tomorrow. My job there. It's important, I guess. But it doesn't feel like it matters, not like what you're doing here." Helen chuckled softly. "You think I started out knowing this mattered? I've had doubts too, Oliver. But I've learned that sometimes To figure out where you belong, you've got to keep moving forward. You've got to listen, not just to others, but to yourself. Her words struck a chord. For the past week, Oliver had been meeting people who believed so deeply in their roles, no matter how small. Their stories had awakened something in him, a desire to understand, to contribute, to break free from his own indifference. The next morning, Oliver stood at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. The highway signs pointed two ways. One led back to the city, to his desk, and his routine. The other pointed deeper into the country, to the neighboring towns he'd only heard about in passing. He hesitated, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The safe choice was clear: return to his office, write his report, and move on. But something inside him whispered that this was a chance to do more. Taking a deep breath, Oliver made his decision. He turned toward the unknown. The first town he arrived at was Greenville, a slightly larger community with its own set of challenges. He parked outside a community center, where he saw a line of people gathered for an early voting drive. Inside, he met Maria, a volunteer who had been working tirelessly to help immigrants navigate the voting process. "We're not just helping people vote," Maria explained, her eyes lighting up with passion. "We're helping them feel like they're part of something. Many of them never thought their voice mattered." Maria's words mirrored what Oliver had been hearing all week. Each story he encountered seemed to deepen his understanding of what the election, and democracy itself, truly meant. In the days that followed, Oliver visited more towns, more centers, and more people. He met a truck driver who took unpaid leave to transport voters in rural areas. He met a single mother running a food truck that doubled as a mobile polling station. He listened to farmers, factory workers, and teachers, all eager to share their hopes and fears about the future. For the first time, Oliver felt a connection to his job that went beyond paperwork. He realized that his role in facilitating elections wasn't just a bureaucratic task, it was a vital part of giving these people a voice. One night, while staying at a roadside motel, Oliver sat down to write a letter to Mr. Thompson. It wasn't a resignation, but a request for more field assignments, for opportunities to work directly with the people he was serving. As he finished the letter, he looked out at the vast, star-filled sky. For the first time in years, he didn't feel small or insignificant. He felt like part of something much larger, a country made up of millions of voices, each one worth hearing. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew he had made the right choice. When Oliver returned to the elections office, it was as though he was stepping into a different world. The same beige cubicles, buzzing fluorescent lights, and familiar routine greeted him. But he no longer felt like the same person. His cross-state journey had ignited something inside him, a purpose, a determination to make a difference. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and stared at the to-do list waiting for him. It was the same list as always: filing reports, processing voter registrations, and responding to emails. But this time, he didn't simply dive into the monotony. Instead, he clicked open a blank document and began typing. In the weeks that followed, Oliver's transformation became evident to his colleagues. He started suggesting ways to streamline processes to make voting more accessible. He volunteered to lead workshops for new employees, sharing stories from his travels to inspire them. Most surprising of all, he asked Mr. Thompson if he could take on additional responsibilities, including writing communications for the office. "Communications?" Mr. Thompson asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're usually pretty quiet, Oliver. What's brought this on?" Oliver smiled. "I've been listening to people, sir, real people with real stories. I think our job isn't just to facilitate elections, it's to remind everyone why their voice matters. I'd like to help us tell that story." Soon, Oliver found himself crafting speeches, newsletters, and community outreach materials. He poured his experiences into his words, sharing the hopes and struggles of the people he'd met. His speeches, written for the office's public forums and later for local candidates, resonated with voters. They carried the voices of farmers, teachers, truck drivers, and volunteers, people who had inspired him and whose stories deserved to be heard. One of the first speeches he wrote was for a young candidate running for a state legislature seat. The candidate, a former teacher, wanted to focus on education reform, but struggled to connect emotionally with voters. Oliver drew on his time with Maria, the volunteer helping immigrants, and Linda, the high school teacher from Willow Creek. The speech began. Democracy is more than casting a ballot. It's the belief that every child deserves a chance to dream, that every family's voice matters, and that every individual has a role to play in shaping our future. The candidate won the election. Oliver's days became filled with purpose. He spent weekends volunteering at local community centers, helping organize voter drives, and speaking to groups about the importance of civic engagement. While he remained behind the scenes, his influence began to ripple outward, touching more lives than he ever imagined. He even began mentoring young interns at the elections office, encouraging them to see their work not as a job, but as a mission. "You're not just pushing papers," he'd tell them. "You're pushing people's voices forward." Years later, Oliver found himself standing in a crowded room watching a live broadcast of a congressional debate. The candidate on stage was reading from a speech Oliver had helped write, a speech filled with the voices of people like Helen, Ryan, and Tom. The candidate spoke passionately about the overlooked communities that were the backbone of the nation. Oliver smiled. He didn't need recognition or applause. It was enough to know he had played a small part in helping others believe in something bigger than themselves. For the first time in his life, Oliver felt truly alive. He had found his place, not as a faceless cog in a machine, but as someone who helped turn the wheels of progress. As he left the event and stepped into the cool night air, Oliver looked up at the stars. He thought of the long road he had traveled, the people he had met, and the stories that had changed his life. He walked to his car with a quiet certainty. His journey wasn't over. There were still stories to tell, still voices to amplify, and still a world to change, one word, one action, one vote at a time.